The air in Aachen during that October of 1944 was a foul mixture, a testament to a city being systematically dismantled. It carried the acrid tang of cordite from spent shells, the sweet, sickly odor of wet plaster and pulverized brick, and beneath it all the faint metallic hint of old blood. The war here had shed its grand operational skin. The sweeping advances across the French countryside, the thunderous barrages that painted the horizon with fire, these were memories. Here, in the corpse of a city that had once crowned emperors, the conflict had shrunk, becoming terrifyingly intimate. It was a war of inches fought in stairwells behind broken furniture and across the thresholds of shattered homes. The distant rumbling orchestra of artillery was merely the backdrop. The main performance was a stark percussive solo played out in the confines of a single room. For the men of the 26th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, every sense was stretched to its breaking point. Vision was limited to the next doorway, the next shadowy corner. Sound was deceptive. The scuttle of a rat could sound like a grenade being rolled across the floor, and the creak of a dying building could mask the footfall of an enemy soldier. In this claustrophobic nightmare, the standard issue M1 Garand, a magnificent and powerful battle rifle, became a liability. Its long barrel was difficult to maneuver. Around tight corners, its powerful 30-06 round could overpenetrate walls with unpredictable consequences, and its en-bloc clip, when ejected with that distinctive ringing ping, was a siren's call to any German listening in the silence. It was in these moments that the soldier's world contracted to the weapon he could bring to bear in a single violent instant. And for the American GI, that weapon was the Colt M1911A1. It was not a graceful firearm. It was a tool, a heavy angular piece of Parkerized steel that felt solid and final in the hand. Weighing over 2.5 pounds loaded, it was a statement of brutal pragmatism. Its design was a direct response to the failures of a previous war where .38 caliber sidearms had proven useless against fanatical Moro warriors in the Philippines. The Army demanded a man-stopper, and John Moses Browning delivered. The .45 ACP cartridge it fired was a slow, heavy, blunt-nosed projectile that did not wound so much as it delivered a devastating kinetic shock, a sledgehammer blow that could drop a target where they stood. As a squad moved through the carcass of an apartment building, the dynamic shifted. The rifleman provided the base of fire, but the point man, the first one through the door, was often the man with the pistol in his hand. His world became a series of violent, fleeting snapshots. Kicking open a door to a bedroom, his eyes would sweep the space in a heartbeat under the bed frame, the open closet, the space behind the door. There was no time for careful aim. Engagement was instinctual, a point and shoot exercise where the sheer power of the .45 compensated for any lack of precision. The report of the pistol in such a confined space was not a crack, but a deafening concussive boom that slammed against the eardrums and left a ringing silence in its wake. The aftermath was a sensory overload that just as quickly faded into a numb void. The sharp, distinctive smell of burnt, smokeless powder would fill the small room, a smell that would cling to a man's uniform for days. Spent brass casings glinting in the dim light would clatter to the floor, their hollow sound echoing the finality of the action. And then the silence would descend again, heavier and more oppressive than before, punctuated only by the ragged, desperate gasps for air from the man who had just fought for his life in a space no larger than a closet. He would feel the weight of the pistol in his hand, its slide locked back on an empty chamber, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the barrel. The weapon was more than a tool. In that moment, it was an extension of his own will to survive, a heavy metallic promise of violence that stood between him and the abyss. This was the crucible that forged the M1911A1's legend, not on the firing range, but in the ruined homes of a dying city where every cleared room was a victory and every corner held the potential for a final fatal encounter. To understand the sheer visceral presence of the M1911A1 in the ruins of Aachen, one must journey back 4 decades to another war in another jungle-clad archipelago. The Philippine-American War at the dawn of the 20th century presented the U.S. military with a brutal lesson in ballistics. The standard issue .38 long Colt revolver, a relatively anemic cartridge, had proven tragically inadequate against charging Moro warriors who, fueled by religious fervor, would continue their advance even after being shot multiple times. The U.S. cavalry, fighting for its life, was forced to dig out aging single-action .45 Colt revolvers from storage weapons whose heavy, slow-moving projectile could reliably drop a man in his tracks. The message was written in blood. For a soldier's sidearm to be effective, it must possess decisive stopping power. This hard-won lesson ignited a formal search for a new self-loading pistol, a quest that would bring one of history's greatest firearms inventors to the fore, John Moses Browning. The result of his genius was not a delicate instrument, but a mechanical masterpiece of brute force elegance. The M1911 was a short recoil-operated semi-automatic pistol whose very operation was a testament to its power. When fired, the barrel and slide remained locked together for a short distance, allowing chamber pressure to drop to a safe level before the barrel tilted down, unlocking from the slide and ejecting the spent casing. This system was designed from the ground up to handle the potent .45 ACP cartridge, a fat, slow-moving round that transferred its immense energy directly into its target, creating a massive wound channel and devastating hydrostatic shock. Pistol that entered service in 1911 was refined into the M1911A1 in 1924, featuring a slightly arched mainspring housing a shorter trigger and cutouts behind the trigger to aid manipulation. This was the weapon that went to war in 1941. Its controls were simple, robust, and designed for instinctual use under stress. The grip safety prevented the pistol from firing unless held firmly in the hand. The manual thumb safety, located perfectly for a sweeping motion of the thumb, provided a definitive positive click that gave a soldier confidence when carrying a round in the chamber. To load a soldier would insert a 7-round steel magazine, pull back the heavily serrated slide, and release it, sending a .45 caliber round home with a solid metallic thud. It was a process that communicated reliability and raw power. This doctrine of stopping power was ingrained in every soldier who trained with the weapon. On ranges from Georgia to Normandy, men learned to trust the M1911A1's formidable reputation. They learned its heft, its distinct report, and the authoritative kick that was more of a solid push in the palm than a sharp snap. It was a weapon that demanded respect, and in return, it offered a profound sense of security. It was the last line of defense, the tool for the most desperate moments when the fight was measured in breaths, not yards. This was the philosophical and physical foundation, carried by every American officer, tanker, and NCO as they boarded their landing craft and stepped onto the European continent, a belief forged in the jungles of the Philippines, perfected by a genius inventor and soon to be tested in the most brutal close-quarters combat the world had ever seen. The stage was set for the .45 caliber iron to prove its worth. While the American GI placed his trust in the singular brute force philosophy of the M1911A1, his German counterpart operated in a world of stark contrast and improvisation. There was no single German 1911. Instead, the Wehrmacht sidearm inventory was a chaotic tapestry of pre-war designs, occupied nations' manufacturing, and the pragmatic recognition of an enemy's superiority. This was not a unified doctrine, but a desperate scramble to arm a military machine, stretched across two fronts. The standard issue sidearm for German forces was the Walther P38, a modern and capable 9mm pistol intended to replace the iconic Luger P08. The P38 was a testament to German engineering, efficient, accurate, and easier to mass-produce than the finely machined Luger. Its double-action trigger allowed a soldier to carry it safely with a round chambered ready to fire with a long, heavy pull of the trigger. Yet for all its advancements, the P38 fired the same 9mm parabellum cartridge as its predecessor. A capable man's stopper in its own right, the 9mm's smaller, faster bullet lacked the immediate fight-ending impact of the .45 ACP in the close confines of a room where a single shot could decide the outcome. This difference in terminal ballistics was not a matter of statistics, but of survival. Beyond the standard issue lay a bewildering array of captured weapons, a direct result of the Blitzkrieg's success. French MAB Model Ds, Belgian Browning high powers, and Czech CZ-27s, all in various calibers, most commonly .32 ACP, found their way into German holsters. This created a logistical nightmare for ammunition supply and stripped the soldier of a consistent, reliable tool. A soldier facing a GI in a darkened cellar armed with a captured .32 caliber pistol was at a distinct disadvantage against the consistent, overwhelming power of the American .45. This disparity did not go unnoticed by the German high command. They saw the effectiveness of the M1911A1 in the hands of paratroopers and rangers. In a direct, if flattering, form of imitation, the German arms manufacturer Mauser began producing a near-identical copy of the Browning design. The Pistole 65P7N. Chambered for the .45 ACP cartridge itself, this was a direct acknowledgement of the American round's superior stopping power in close combat. However, these copies were produced in limited numbers, primarily for use by the Brandenburger Special Forces units. For the vast majority of German soldiers, no such equivalent was available. They faced the roaring .45 with their 9mm and their assorted lesser-caliber sidearms, a tangible symbol of the industrial and philosophical gap that had begun to define the war's final brutal acts. The duel was set, and on paper the American held the superior hand. The theoretical debate over caliber and design was settled not on test ranges, but in the ruined landscapes where men fought and died. As the Allied advance pushed into the dense hedgerows of Normandy and the shattered urban centers of Western Europe, the M1911a1 found its brutal purpose. The close-range, sudden nature of this fighting was a world away from the open fields of military doctrine. It was in these moments of shocking violence that the .45 caliber pistol earned its legendary status. In the Bocage country, a soldier's war was measured in feet. A GI pushing through a thick hedgerow could find himself face-to-face with a German machine gun nest at 10 yards. The Garand was a long, unwieldy instrument for such an encounter, but the M1911a1 drawn from a hip holster could be brought to bear in an instant. The report was a deafening boom in the quiet countryside, a sound that often signaled the abrupt, violent end of a close-quarters struggle. The pistol's reputation grew. With each engagement, a whispered assurance passed between soldiers. It was known as the room broom, a weapon that could clear a trench or a farmhouse kitchen with terrifying efficiency. Its sheer power was its most defining characteristic. A single hit from a .45 ACP round, even if not immediately fatal, delivered a massive hydrostatic shock that would often drop a man, ending the immediate threat. It was the ultimate tool for what the soldiers grimly called trench clearing or hole searching. This was not a duel of aimed, deliberate fire. It was a violent, instinctual reaction. The training to point, shoot, to fire from the hip without using the sights became paramount. In the gloom of a basement or the confusion of a rubble-strewn street, there was no time to align the front and rear posts. It was a matter of pointing the heavy frame in the direction of the threat and pulling the trigger. The M1911a1's design facilitated this. Its natural grip angle and significant weight made it a stable platform for this kind of instinctive shooting. The two-stage trigger with its clear take-up and crisp break allowed for rapid, controlled shots. When a German soldier armed with a 9mm Walther P38 faced an American with a .45 in these conditions, the difference could be stark. The 9mm round, while lethal, was more likely to pass through a target, with less immediate fight-stopping energy. The .45, by contrast, transferred all of its substantial force into the target, creating a devastating wound channel. Anecdotes from survivors cemented the pistol's lore. Stories circulated of a staff sergeant in Aachen who used his 1911 to engage 3 German soldiers in a stairwell at point-blank range, stopping each one with a single shot. Another told of a paratrooper in the Bulge surrounded in a foxhole, who fought off a final German assault with his pistol after his rifle jammed in the freezing cold. These stories, whether entirely accurate or embellished by time, served a vital purpose. They reinforced the soldier's faith in his last-ditch weapon. In a war of machines and massed artillery, the M1911a1 represented a personal, almost primal form of security. It was the final argument, the last ounce of American iron that stood between a soldier and his death in the dark, cramped corners of the European theater. The crucible of combat had proven the value of John Browning's design beyond any doubt. Beyond the ballistic data and the tactical doctrines, the true relationship between a soldier and his sidearm was forged in the subjective sensory experience of its use. The M1911a1 was not an abstract concept. It was a physical object with a distinct personality, a weight and a voice that became intimately familiar to the man who carried it. Its first impression was always its heft. Weighing nearly 3 pounds loaded, it was a solid, substantial presence on the hip. This was not a lightweight accessory. It was a tool that announced itself with every step. This weight, however, was a trade-off. It contributed directly to the weapon's manageable recoil. The .45 ACP cartridge generated significant force, but the pistol's mass absorbed much of it, resulting in a perceived recoil that was a heavy, authoritative push straight back into the palm, rather than a sharp, snapping muzzle flip. This allowed for faster, more controlled follow-up shots, a critical factor in a life-or-death struggle where a second might be all that stood between survival and oblivion. The controls were mechanical, deliberate, and satisfyingly positive. The act of inserting a 7-round magazine required a firm, sure smack to seat it home. The slide release, the safety, these were not delicate switches. They were levers that operated with distinct metallic clicks that could be felt as much as heard. Engaging the thumb safety produced a definitive click that gave a soldier absolute confidence that the weapon would not fire until he was ready. Disengaging it was a single sweeping motion of the thumb, a motion drilled into muscle memory through endless repetition. This tactile auditory feedback was a language of readiness and safety in an environment of chaos. In contrast, a German soldier's experience was often one of fragmentation. If he was lucky, he had a P38, a fine pistol in its own right with its modern double-action trigger. But if he was issued a captured Belgian or French pistol, the experience was one of lesser authority. The smaller, faster cartridges like the .32 ACP produced a sharper, less substantial report and a snappier recoil impulse. The weapons themselves were often lighter, less robust. In the moment of truth, when fear and adrenaline coursed through a man's veins, the M1911A1 offered a psychological anchor. Its sheer physical presence, its thunderous report, and its reputation for decisive power granted a form of grim confidence. It was a known quantity. It was heavy, it was loud, and it worked. For the American GI, the weight in his hand was the weight of a promise that when all else failed, he had one last devastating argument to make. This was not merely a matter of caliber, but of the entire combat ecosystem, the feel, the sound, the very soul of the weapon in the crucible of close combat. As the guns fell silent in 1945, the M1911A1 had transcended its role as a mere tool of war. It had become a symbol, an icon, etched into the very identity of the American fighting man. Its legacy was not one born from pristine factory floors or ordnance committee reports, but from the mud of the Ardennes, the snow of the Bulge, and the rubble of 1,000 shattered towns. It was a legacy written in the first-hand accounts of veterans who decades later would speak of the pistol, not with cold analysis, but with a reverence usually reserved for a thing that had saved their lives. The war had proven the foundational doctrine of stopping power beyond any reasonable doubt. While the German military, out of necessity, had embraced a patchwork of sidearms and calibers, the United States had maintained a singular, unwavering standard. The value of this consistency was immeasurable. Every officer, every tank crewman, every paratrooper knew the weapon in his holster. They knew its operation, its capabilities, its limitations. This universal familiarity bred a collective confidence that became part of the American military's psychological fabric. The M1911A1 was a tangible piece of that confidence. Its influence did not end with the surrender of Germany and Japan. As the world plunged into the Cold War, the 1911 remained the standard sidearm of the U.S. military. It would see combat again in the jungles of Korea and the steaming rice paddies of Vietnam. In Korea, where close-quarter battles against human wave attacks were a grim reality, the 45's stopping power was once again called upon to hold the line in the desperate final moments of a fight. In Vietnam, it was the trusted sidearm of special forces teams and tunnel rats who crawled into the claustrophobic darkness of the Cu Chi tunnels where, just as in the ruins of Aachen, a long rifle was a death sentence. And the only thing that mattered was the firepower you could bring to bear in a space no larger than a coffin. The stories that returned from these conflicts further cemented the legend. They were tales of reliability under the most adverse conditions, of pistols caked in mud, submerged in water, yet still functioning flawlessly when a life depended on it. The design, with its minimal number of parts and robust construction, proved incredibly resilient. It was a weapon that asked for little maintenance and offered unwavering performance in return. This was the ultimate testament to John Moses Browning's genius. He had not created a delicate, finely tuned instrument. He had forged a brute, a mechanical guardian that was as tough and enduring as the soldiers who carried it. The M1911A1 had earned its place not just in the armories of a nation, but in the soul of its military, a legacy forged in iron and blood and passed down through generations of warriors. In the silent, hollowed-out buildings of Aachen, in the frozen foxholes of the Ardennes, and in the oppressive darkness of Pacific bunkers, the final argument was often the same. It was not the sustained roar of a machine gun or the concussive blast of a grenade. It was a single definitive boom that cut through the chaos, a period at the end of a sentence of violence. The M1911A1 was more than a collection of steel parts. It was the physical manifestation of a nation's industrial might and a single unwavering philosophical belief that when a soldier is forced to fight for his life at arm's length, he deserves a weapon that guarantees the fight will end there. Today, the world's militaries have largely moved on. The age of the high-capacity 9mm pistol has dawned, prioritizing volume of fire over the decisive impact of a single round. The battlefields are different, the tactics evolved, yet the M1911 endures. It is found in the holsters of specialized units who still value its unmatched stopping power and crisp trigger. It is cherished by collectors and competitive shooters, a timeless design that continues to perform over a century after its birth. But its most profound legacy lies not in its continued service, but in the memory it represents. For the veterans who carried it, the weight of the empty pistol once cleaned and stored away was a weight they would carry forever. It was the weight of survival. The cold steel was a tactile memory of the friends who did not return, of the fears faced, and of the will that carried them through the darkest moments of the 20th century. The M1911A1 was their final safeguard, a last best hope when the world had collapsed into a maelstrom of close-range terror. It was not a weapon of aggression. but one of ultimate defense, a promise written in steel and fulfilled in the most desperate of hours. In the end, the story of the .45 caliber iron is not just a story of a firearm. It is the story of the men who held it, and the deafening consequential silence that followed its final fateful shot.